I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Bob Fournier. He's known to everybody, his long service to the city. I will add a personal note here. When I reach out to city staff or chartered officials, I would say Bob has been the most accessible individual on staff. I really appreciate it. Try not to bug you too much, but on a couple matters, we've become long-term pen pals.
Sure.
Bob, you've been with this city how many years?
20 years now this year.
20 years.
Well, as city attorney.
City attorney, okay. And I think everybody knows that Bob is going to be retiring in February or March.
Somewhere in there.
Somewhere.
The date isn't exact yet.
Yeah. And I've told him that we have committee seats available on DSCA. He's looking for something. So I think we'd like to kind of jump right into this. I told Bob that our MO is we have our guest speak for 20-25 minutes, and then we turn it over for questions. And our protocol for questions is board members first, and then member reps, and then depending on time and my mood, we may recognize some other guests. So I think Bob and I, some of the most topical things from a DSCA standpoint is noise ordinance, where things stand with that. Of course, the transition in place as we retire. But I'd, in a way, like to give you some leeway to speak about, things you think are important. Of course, first and foremost, I think is the noise matter. We have identified new outdoor eating establishments coming, 3 or 4. Some are really high end. Bandito's one Bob and I have talked about. So there was a time to get something on noise in place. It's right sooner. So with that said, let me turn on the video here, and then how are we working on sound? Let's do obviously. Audible. There we go. Oh, there we go. Bob is in the bottom right for those of you on the Zoom. So take it away.
All right. Put my phone out here, not because I'm expecting a call, but because you said 20 minutes, I just want to make sure I don't ramble on for too long here. When you first asked me, David, and thank you for the introduction, by the way, come and talk about the noise ordinance, or sometimes it's actually called the sound ordinance. It's a little probably less pejorative, but I was a little bit dubious because this has certainly been one of the more challenging issues that I've had to deal with in the past 20 years, just because the ordinance is antiquated, I think, and especially the section that deals with the maximum decibel limits on a sound. And I guess really for about the first 10 years, there wasn't too much discussion on it, but about 10 years ago, it came up for the first time, and lots of unresolved issues, because my recollection there is that it sort of devolved into an argument among people who thought that it would be better to promote entertainment downtown and actually raise decibel limits that were there, and those that thought they ought to be lower, which wasn't what I set out to do in the beginning at all. It was to simply clarify and revise some of the organizational structure, the provisions in it, so that it would be easier to enforce, because the police department has historically been the enforcing agency, and they have repeatedly asked for simplification or clarification, and I think justifiably so. So more recently, though, I think it's been difficult simply because of the number of issues in there that have to be addressed. And it's a real challenge, when you have even sometimes one hard issue to address, and if you have a whole list of them, it just makes it more difficult. So that I think has been, but the last time this was discussed was back in February of this year, and I think there was significant progress made. And the discussion then turned about four components. I suggested or recommended to the commission, which was accepted, to break what needed to be done down into 4 different ordinances, and 2 of those have been done. The first one was to take the sound emanating from motor vehicles that was in the city code, put it back. Florida statutes were amended now so that we could go back and let the police department enforce the statutes rather than the ordinance when it came to sound from motor vehicles, which they wanted to do. So that's out of the way. The second one was to transfer enforcement jurisdiction from the county court judge to a special magistrate appointed by the city, the special magistrate that does the code compliance hearings. That has been done, but it's not fully implemented, and unfortunately it's going to take longer to implement for reasons I hope I can get into than we thought originally. But I want to talk today about some of that and some of the reasons why we thought that was a positive thing to do. And then talk a little bit about the lack of clarity, or I guess it's not so much clarity, it is the organizational structure of how the section of the code that regulates decibel limits is set up. And that's what I'm hoping to clarify, and then talk briefly about the use of the plainly audible standard, which is something that has gotten a lot of play lately anyway in conversation. So that's sort of where I see this going. And so first of all, on the enforcement jurisdiction, actually, I think it was intended that jurisdiction be transferred to the special magistrate years ago, because there was a provision in the city code when you look at the jurisdiction of the special magistrate, it said the magistrate has jurisdiction over the sound ordinance. But the provisions in the sound ordinance itself all said that the violations went to the county court. So we finally got that resolved, and I think that's a good thing. And the first reason for that is because of the fines. Initially for a long time, they're higher now, and I can explain that, but the fine for an uncontested first violation was only $100. And I think for a lot of people, if you have a business that's an entertainment venue and they can afford to just pay an extra $100 a night for violating and voluntarily pay the fine, it's not really a strong incentive to comply. And so I think there was general agreement that the fines should be increased. And there's actually 2 sets of fines that come into play here. There's the set that if the violation is contested and it goes to a hearing, there's a fine that can be greater than if someone voluntarily pays it and doesn't. In other words, by statute, we're required to incentivize not contesting the violation and paying a lower fine in that event. So just to start out with, the maximum fine that a county court judge can impose on anyone is $500. And that's the maximum across the board fine. Now, the special magistrate, by contrast, has the ability to levy fines of $250 a day for the first violation, $500 per day for the second. And even though sound violations are not per day, this is the real part that sort of made me interested in transferring the jurisdiction, is that upon a finding that the violation is irreversible or irreparable, which sound ordinance is when you think about it, because once the sound has been heard, you can't really fix it or unring the bell. They have jurisdiction to impose a fine of $5,000 as opposed to $500. So that made it a good thing. But it gets better, because there is a statute that cities in Florida with more than 50,000 people have the option or the ability to, by a supermajority vote, increase those fines. And in looking into this, I didn't remember it, although I was around back in 1999. The commission at that time adopted an ordinance to take advantage of this provision to increase those fines. And so they're increased, rather than the first fine being $250 a day, it's actually $1,000 for the first time, and then $5,000 for a repeat violation. And if upon a finding that the violation is irreparable or irreversible, they can go up as much as $15,000. Now, I'm not saying that this needs to be punitive, but there have been some businesses that are just chronic violators, and I think that's a tool to be used for someone who's just consistently not in compliance. Not that there's going to be some sort of a crackdown or something like that, but at least there's some bite to the penalty, if you will, as opposed to just $100 fines. And so one of I might mention the other reason that was attractive is because Generally speaking, the code compliance violations are different. They're, things like overgrown lots, weeds, trash, rubbish, or a car maybe that's inoperable in the yard or something like that. And the compliance officer has to give by statute a reasonable time to comply. And that really doesn't work in the context of the sound ordinance because the violation happens once, it's not continuing. But because of that provision that I mentioned about in the event of an irreparable or irreversible injury, the one-time fine is so much greater than you could get in county court. That's why it seemed like an attractive option. But we've had to do some implementation and change the particular form for a notice of violation that a code compliance officer would use to come up with a specialized form for a notice of violation that's just particular or peculiar to the sound ordinance only, because the corrective period for a sound ordinance violation is in a matter of minutes, not days. I think probably 15 minutes. Sometimes if there's music playing, because of crowd control issues like that, in the officer's discretion, they may want to let them finish the set or something like that. So you've got to be reasonable about it, but it's certainly not going to, I'm coming back in 5 days, and that just doesn't work in this context. So, and then the second reason I think that we did this is just the flexibility and the ability to make a record. And I don't know if anybody's ever been in county court, but county court is sort of set up for as traffic court and DUIs and tenant evictions and small claims and that sort of thing. And there's often a waiting line of people in the room, and you're somewhat rushed sometimes, not always. Some of the judges do try to be accommodating, of course, but you can't always count on getting the time that you might need to have a hearing. It's difficult to have citizens participate or testify to what they've heard to, that sort of thing. So, but with a special magistrate, who is someone that's retained by the city commission, arrangements can be made, and if there's opposing counsel, you can get a convenient time, you can take as much as you need, you can schedule an afternoon, whatever. And the reason that's important is because these hearings, when they're appealed, and either from the county court or the special magistrate, they both get appealed to the circuit court to the same place, but thereby a process called certiorari, where the appeal is just based on the record. There's no new testimony on the appeal, so it's very important that you get enough time to put all the testimony on that you need, and therefore you have a better record. So that was important. And then one thing that we did add that I think will hopefully help, I'm just going to read you this provision, is a joint and several liability provision. There was a question a lot of times on, there's tenants in these businesses, there's people that are there playing the music, or managers as opposed to the owners. So we added a provision that says the individual controlling or responsible for maintaining the volume of the sound or excessive noise, the operator and or owner of the premises, that is the sound source, shall each be subject to liability for violations of this chapter, and if prosecuted jointly, each shall be jointly and severally liable for any fines imposed pursuant to this chapter. So the city could choose to go after either one for the full amount of the fine in that event. So just to give it a little more, ability to impose a stronger penalty to perhaps make some of these establishments think harder about violating it. And fortunately, I'm sure there's been some incidents out there here and there, but right now, I don't think there's anyone who's chronically violating, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but no complaints have reached me anyway, as has been the case in the past. So that's sort of the rundown on why we went to the special magistrate. We're now working, like I said, on development of new forms and working out some of the implementation issues with SPD. And I think before we can fully implement this, I think we're going to need to have the other amendments in place. The other two ordinances that I talked about, one would have been addressing the decibel limits and the other plainly audible. And initially I thought that it would be best to perhaps separate those into two different ordinances for simplicity, but in thinking about it further, and they were going to be scheduled for this fall, but I think maybe it would be better to present both together in a single ordinance. It doesn't mean the vote has to be taken. And the reason for that is they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Some jurisdictions do plainly audible alone, and they don't have decibel limits. There's not that many, but there are some. I think St. Pete has tried that. And some out-of-state cities I've seen, and they have decibel limits, but you can have an ordinance that has both. The plainly audible limitation, I'll talk about in a minute, sometimes doesn't apply till after a certain hour in time. We've also had some issues with the noise meters, and I'm looking at, I know the kind of meter that SPD uses. There are some special meters out there now that can be used explicitly solely to measure bass sounds, the low frequency sounds. That's not specified in the code. I think that it could be. I know, one of the issues, SPD does a lot of cross training. They switch people from one position to another, and that can be very beneficial. But I think perhaps with regard to the soundish ordinance, it might be a little detrimental, because I'm trying to suggest that maybe they have a core group of officers that are very skilled on these meters, because I've heard a lot of times in talking to residents, people always compliment the officers and they say how professional they are and how, how pleasant they were to deal with, et cetera. But a couple of people have said, but I sense there might have been a slight lack of familiarity with the equipment, and it is difficult to operate. So I think that's something we're trying to look at and talk about too. And these, as like I said, the sound, of course, as you know, is measured in decibels, and there's A frequency, which is the mid-range sounds, the sounds that are audible to the human ear. But there's also limits in the code about the sound measured through the C sound filters, which measures both low and high frequency sounds. So we could have meters, separate meters that specialize in just that. And the type of meter, unfortunately, I'd say unfortunately, because it takes longer, has to be specified in the ordinance, because they have to know what the standard is. So we're sort of working through that right now. But before I get into the decibel limits provisions, I want to say just one thing is the First Amendment comes into play here, because I think everybody knows about freedom of speech and how you're free to express yourself, and that's protected under the First Amendment. But when it comes to, how am I doing on the time? Okay, all right. When it comes to music, music also gets First Amendment protection. So what that means is you want to have an objective standard of measurement. You see sound ordinances that say things like, if it's offensive to a person of reasonable or normal sensibilities, and that's all well and good, but that works for sounds like construction sounds, machinery, dogs barking. You can get 8 neighbors to come in and say that dog barked for 8 hours straight, and I thought I would go crazy and prove a violation, but you can't do that with music. So the one way to measure it is through decibels, because that's objective and it's either over the limit or under the limit, or the plainly audible is another, when I get to that. So when it comes to the decibel limits section of the ordinance, the problem, I think, is not so much with the decibel limits, although maybe sometime those would be looked at, and I think you'd have to hire a consultant to do that. And I've said I really want to leave those the same, but I want to come up with a different organization. The problems with the ordinance, I think there's two things that have to be addressed. The ordinance right now categorizes sound so that it regulates amplified sound as a separate category of sound. But yet amplified sound is only regulated when it comes from a source that's not within a completely enclosed building. And it's only specifically regulated after a certain time in the evening. So I've had arguments made to me that means amplified sound is left unregulated during the daytime. And that hasn't been a problem yet, but conceivably it could be. And then there's a section that deals with impulsive source sound, which is something like an explosion or a gun going off, and we've never had a violation like that. So I question whether that needs to be in there. And then continuous source sound, which is not defined in the ordinance, which if you give it its literal meaning, of course it means it's continuous sound, and haven't had anybody argue yet that when a live band stops playing, that means it's not continuous, but give them time, they will. So I think taking all those out and just regulating sound by the source of the sound makes more sense. So what I had recommended is you just have 2 categories of sound that comes from an outside source, sound that comes from an inside source. And I think that would simplify it a great deal. And then you have the hours that the sound is regulated. And very loosely, generally speaking, it would be daytime hours and nighttime hours. So I envision something that could even be reduced to a sort of a matrix, where you might have whatever the daytime hours selected are, whatever time the sound is to be lowered, whether it's 10, 11, midnight, 1 in the morning, whatever the commission sets it at. And then a box for inside source and outside source. So it would be easy to see, and you'd avoid all this complication that you have now, which in all fairness is hard for the officers to understand. And I'm told a disproportionate share of the new officers get the night shift when most of the sound occurrences occur. So, you know, that's yet another problem. So that's what I'm looking at with the decibel levels. Now, plainly audible is something I've talked about, but plainly audible means exactly what you think it would mean. It means that sound that could be heard by an individual, an officer, using their normal hearing facilities or auditory senses at a specified distance from the source. So this is an attractive option because it's simple, straightforward, and it's easy to understand. And it also eliminates the need to use meters or sound measuring devices after a certain time. And so there are two regulatory aspects that come into play when you talk about regulating plainly audible sound. And the first one I mentioned is the distance from the source of the sound, because you have to have that in there so that the enforcement isn't arbitrary. The officers have to be the same distance away. And the hours during which you prohibit plainly audible sound. There have been some jurisdictions that tried to do it on a 24-hour basis, and I haven't found one yet that was upheld because the courts all say that's overbroad. You're prohibiting more sound than you need to accomplish the objective of the ordinance. I can explain what I mean by that in a minute. So the two primary ways to challenge a plainly audible sound regulation would be that it's vague. And if you have an ordinance that's vague, it means essentially that you don't give a person of ordinary knowledge and intelligence a fair notice of the conduct that you're prohibiting by the ordinance. So you don't understand what is you're not supposed to do. But fortunately here, and this is what has made plainly audible so attractive, a few years back, the Florida Supreme Court held that the standard was not vague. You know, vague might be, in this context, an example I used before, disturbing sound. Well, what is that? You know, how is anybody going to know? And then the second way is that the regulation is overbroad. And what I mean by that is it prohibits more sound than is going to be necessary to accomplish the purpose of the ordinance. So if you have a regulation, say that you have to sort of articulate the objective. And I think generally what I've heard, the objective would be past a certain point of time in the evening, the commission's objective in passing an ordinance like this would be to just protect the right of citizens to have quiet repose in their homes, after a certain hour. So say if you say that plainly audible sound after 8 p.m. is a violation of the ordinance, probably a viable argument can be made that most people are not in bed by 8 p.m. I know I'm not. I mean, maybe if it's in Venice, but but I don't think 8 p.m. is a reasonable time. So that's an issue the commission is going to have to grapple with, I think, is what time that sound goes down. And as I said, there's been cases where I think they tried to be too ambitious with it, and not so much an earlier time, but the jurisdictions that have tried to make plainly audible a violation, all day, they usually get into overbreadth problems, and the courts say that it's not a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction that you can impose because it's not narrowly tailored enough to confine it to accomplishing your objective. So, and then as I mentioned, plainly audible can be used alone, but I think the better way is to combine it with the decibel limits, which is why I want to do one ordinance and then bring that forward later than I had originally anticipated. I thought it would be coming forward as soon as this month, but I think now we're looking more like December, January, but it'll be coming up. But this is something I want to address, and we talked about it months ago, so we have to get it moving forward. So I think I'll stop here, and that sort of summarizes the basics of what I wanted to cover, just generally speaking, but there are a lot of challenges. I don't think I've talked about all of them, and I haven't gotten into the specifics of the particular sections, but that's probably enough for right
now. Great. Just one thing I wanted to recognize, Vice Mayor has joined us, and Mayor Albert is here, so welcome. With that said, questions, Ken?
Maybe this is one of the things that you haven't dealt with yet, but what about moving violations like in automobiles?
Okay, thank you for asking that, because moving violations, of course, in the automobiles, they have a plainly audible standard for that. And it's been generally recognized that the distances imposed there, like the state statute, is 25 feet, but you could never get away with that from a stationary source sound. There's probably too much ambient sound. So the later you go, of course, in the evening, when plainly audible would click in, the lesser distance you can get away with. But one of these that was invalidated, I think it was from Mobile, Alabama, and they're commonly used. It isn't so much that you can't use them, it's just that they have to be applied correctly. I think they tried a 50-foot limit pretty much all day long, and that just was held unconstitutional because it would prohibit too many sounds that they didn't need to restrict. So you just have to be careful to get it right. And I know I've received some emails from citizens that have researched this, and as I said, it's very common. They've had a list that I checked, and I had most of the ordinances, not all of them, of cities in Florida that have done it, and there's a lot. But I'm more interested actually in knowing not so much where it's been done, but where it's been challenged, and then what the result of the challenge was, because I really don't have any interest in drafting an ordinance that would be struck down like that. So I think we should have some reasonable chance of defending it if it's challenged, and that's something that I more or less have to plan on because I think there's a high likelihood. Maybe not if we get across that this is just, it's like I said, it's not intended as a crackdown. It's just intended to reform and update an antiquated ordinance, quite frankly.
Okay, Kathy?
Yeah, so does this include the pop-ups, like, for lack of a better term, say you have someone who sets up in a corner of like the park or something like that, and they set up amplification and they just blare music. It includes that as well, right?
It should, because I think it should be any source of sound. Now, there is a section in the ordinance that I haven't mentioned that I think we're going to deal with separately that provides for an exemption from the maximum decibel limit in the event they're sponsoring a special event. Say the limit is 75 dBAs or whatever,
Sure.
They can want to go to 90. So if they had a permit for that and it was granted, they could exceed the limit for that temporary duration of the special event.
I guess
But the answer to your question is yes,
Okay.
it is intended to apply.
Yeah, I was more concerned with those that aren't permitted.
But that would be,
Decided to
that
set
just
up.
brought to mind a thought, an example of a situation where the limits might be exceeded if somebody had a permit to do it in connection with a special event. But I'm not addressing that in this ordinance, so I'm glad you brought it up because they're gonna talk about changes to the special events ordinance, and that's where that's gonna be
Okay.
addressed.
Clark?
So, Bob, the difference between an audible sound and a decibel level, is there other characteristics of an audible sound that are irritating that can be measured other than decibels?
See, the benefit or beauty of plainly audible from my perspective is it doesn't really even have to be annoying or irritating, it's just that you can hear it. So, and then decibels, of course, it's measurement and the tools, you have to get that right. But you can have, and I've seen many ordinances that keep the decibel levels in effect. In other words, you can say, let's say it's midnight. After midnight, a plainly audible sound and a specified distance from the source may be a violation, but you could keep the decibel limits in place. So there would be an option enforcement-wise to either measure the decibel levels or just say, the sound was plainly audible at whatever the specified distance is from the source.
How about bass notes? Is that an example of what you were trying to get to? When I lived on St. Armand's, Cha-Cha Coconuts played so late at night, and you didn't hear it until you laid your head on the pillow, and then the bass notes came through the ground.
Well, I have looked at definitions, and I'm going to propose one. Now, the measurement, that specific way to measure the bass is another issue, but to be able to, and it's kind of odd because you think that the bass measurement might be more a factor when you're talking about decibel limits, but I've seen definitions of plainly audible that incorporate the bass sound to say if you can hear that bass component, that's included in plainly audible. So I'm going to try to do that, at least for discussion purposes. It can always, come out. But I think that's worthy. I've done some research on those subwoofer speakers, and that some of them, it's very funny. They advertise like you not only can hear the sound, but you can feel it. So I'm not sure what that means, but you feel the sound and hear it. I guess that it's pretty intense. Yeah.
Peter and I have experienced being in a condo at 1350 where I live on the first floor with a bandstand practically in arm's reach outside with the bass clearly coming through, shutting all the windows and the doors.
Oh, I've
comes
heard
in.
others talk
Yeah.
about that as well, yeah.
Comes in.
But I think ultimately, if that really becomes more of a concern as time goes by, that the way to do that is to perhaps look into some sound meters that, you know, are designed purposefully to measure the bass of the phone.
That's the most irritating part. Peter,
I'm interested in the notice provision. So on a sound violation, notice is at the time it occurs. Is there a condition upon which you have to educate the person getting the notice?
Well, I mean, I think you tell them at the very least that the sound is a violation of the ordinance at the level at least that it's being played, or if it's plainly audible, I mean, it can be played for purposes of people who intend to hear it, but not everybody else. So I don't think there's a duty to instruct or something, but except that I think, you know, any warning involves telling the person that whatever they're doing is in violation.
So I mean, it's just like our educate, encourage, enforce kind of thing.
In a way,
So you
in
can
a way.
educate the person, and then if they continue to do it, you might even encourage them to stop, and after that, you know, just.
well,
issue
we're looking, and this is something that's come up that we thought of is, you know, if you have to warn every time, and you do under the code compliance statute, you can't go back and just warn, and then they turn it down, and that's forever. So we have to find some way in the definition of repeat violation to incorporate a person that's been warned previously within the past, whatever the time period is, maybe as much as a year, maybe only 3 months or something like that. But whatever is reasonable under the circumstances, because you just don't want to build in some way that people can sort of game the system and just, like I said, voluntarily pay $100 every time or something like that.
Bob, I've got a question. Banditos. For those, this is a restaurant concept. Think of between Smokey Joe's and the Gator Club mid-block on the south side of Maine. There is a building permit working its way through the city. It's been in process over a year for an approximately 200-seat restaurant. It is a restaurant in a multi-use zone area. It has a rooftop area. My understanding is that the rooftop area there may be open until the appointed time, 11, I think it is currently. Let's talk weekdays. So at 11, the rooftop area would need to be vacated. But as I understand it, the door into the restaurant, in this case, roll-up garage doors, could remain open.
Actually, no, there was a last minute change, and if you give me a second, I think I brought the ordinance with me, thinking that might come up. The 11 o'clock refers to, I believe that's the closing time for outdoor accessory restaurants. So if you have outdoor seating at your restaurant, the service is supposed to stop at 11. But there was a revised definition for nightclub, if you remember, because that was formerly tied to the type of liquor licenses the establishment had, and that wasn't really always the way these establishments were operating. In other words, you have places like Duval's now that is under the code a nightclub, which, you know, I don't think by anyone's, you go in there and you think it's a restaurant, not a nightclub. But it was added to the definition at first, and we came up with a revised definition, which I think is probably better than the first one. I worked with staff on this, and at first it said that it was going to be live entertainment only after 11, and then the conditional use would be required. We modified that, and then there was a question raised that was asked of me: could we put in the sound ordinance a regulation that required the door or the roll-up window that you're talking about to come down at a certain time? And I said, no, I really think that the sound ordinance is to regulate the generation of sound and the limits on sound, and that the use of property is a zoning regulation. But so if you want, I can read you now. It is in here in the definition of nightclub. Of course, this has to be a nightclub, which means that and it does say in here, windows and doors shall remain continuously closed after 11 p.m. other than to allow the ingress and egress of patrons. And then it goes on, and this was modified from what was originally in there, For purposes of this definition, the term live entertainment shall include but not be limited to live bands or live musicians. And the term amplified entertainment shall include but not be limited to amplified music generated by live DJs, music that is electronically produced and transmitted. And this was the part because there was discussion at the meetings that, well, it had to be live amplified music because we didn't want to make background music a violation of the ordinance. But we were able to address that by saying televised entertainment and background music shall not be considered amplified entertainment. Background music is amplified music intended as unobtrusive accompaniment to some activity such as dining or consuming alcoholic beverages. So that was the best we could do, but at least it's there, so there's some language to work with. I think that concern that, you know, it had to just be if it was only live entertainment. But to answer your question, David, that is now in the definition, so that door has to come down at that time, if it's a nightclub.
Okay. All right, it would take too much time to
Probably would.
get into the details, but of course, that's a poster child for, we've seen some of the promotional materials for their other.
Judging by the
and
materials you showed me
then a
potentially.
follow-on question is, so they just ask for a building permit, that doesn't have to go to the DRC process, this just gets a building permit?
The administrative approvals do go to DRC, and I think that includes the ones that go directly to building permit. So I think DRC would be considering this. I think they review everything. Have you not
I'll
been
check
able to
into
track
that.
this there?
I don't believe so.
I did ask about this recently, and nobody knew the reason why, but they said it was sort of stalled. So I don't think that, it hasn't been withdrawn, but I don't think the opening is imminent. So
Okay,
Yeah.
well, I use that as an example
Yeah,
of
and a good
something
one.
that could be because of its proximity to the mark, and it's in a mixed use area, and what the size of it and so forth. So,
Yeah.
David?
David?
Yeah,
Hi. Yeah. So, hi, Bob, it's Peter Blanton. I guess my question relates not to nightclubs, but sports bars that are planned in residential areas. So the nightclub definition really doesn't help. And a lot of these sports bars will be filed as a restaurant. They'll say 51% of the revenues come from food. And as you can imagine, sports bars can be loud. And a number of these sports bars plan to have roll-up walls. And I think it was a goof or a loophole in the ZTA for bars that it's silent on these roll-up walls, that those roll-up walls in effect could stay open to 2 a.m., noise from the sports bar. It may not be entertainment, but you know, it's going to be loud, and that can go on to 2 in the morning.
No, I had to acknowledge the validity of that concern, and if it becomes a problem, I guess unfortunately somebody's going to have to experience some loud noise that they don't want to hear, but it can be addressed in the zoning code. I think what you might have been alluding to is the new urban mixed use, I think that's the name of it, urban mixed use future land use classification along the commercial corridors.
No, I'm talking about the ZTA for restaurants, bars, and nightclubs.
Okay.
I brought this up to the city commission. Debbie Trice raised it. She goes, I can't believe that we allowed that to go through in that manner. And she wanted to change it, and then it died.
Well, there's no specific definition for sports bars, but I could see bars as a separately defined term. So if there needs to be a similar provision in the future, you know, inserted into bars, I think the premise of this amendment was that nightclubs would be the venues where there would be the most noise generated after 11 p.m. and hence the requirement for the conditional use. But a bar could just be perhaps, you know, what you think of as a bar where you talk to somebody and there's not necessarily entertainment and it's quieter. and maybe nobody would object to that, but you know, you have a fair point. There are sports bars where people congregate to watch television, and they can get raucous at times, and that might be an issue. But if it is, I think it can be addressed in the context of that particular use. So I think you may have a fair point. It's just, and then it's unaddressed now, but it could be if it needs to be in the future.
Yeah, well, I think, when I brought this up, the development services people said, okay, well, yeah, that'll have to be covered by the updated sound ordinance. Because right now we have no protection. You
It's
can,
not going to be.
you have the roll up walls open, lots of noise till 2 a.m.
Yeah, those are land use issues, and they should be regulated in the zoning code, I think.
Yeah,
You
well,
know,
they goofed.
yeah, well, and I mean, of course, that's always a matter of opinion, but it can be debated that, you know, it's not static, that the zoning code can always be amended. They do regular amendments every year, but I think the sound ordinance has to be confined to, you know, the measurement of sound and not get into particular land uses.
Yeah, well, that's what development services said. It's, sorry, that's up to the sound ordinance.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have one question. Who's the question? Jim Toll, a question, sir, as a member rep?
Yeah, Bob. So I actually sent you the question in the chat. I don't know if you had a chance to read it, but
I haven't seen it yet, Jim. Sorry.
okay. So in the before the mid 80s, you know, we had circuit court, county court, municipal courts, and then, you know, the voters of Florida amended the Constitution to eliminate the municipal courts. I think, you know, I am we call it the hearing officer in the city of Northport, but it's the same thing as what the city of Sarasota calls a special magistrate. And it just, I keep telling like the city attorney that, you know, the county court just doesn't want to do this stuff. I mean, that's what's happened. The county court says, no, we're not going to hear these kind of cases anymore. So now, yeah, the special magistrate's hearing them. I'm hearing them. At what point in time is someone going to say, wait a minute, you're violating the Florida Constitution? I mean, for code enforcement, yeah, that was a special statute. And I think there's been appellate cases that upheld, you know, both code enforcement boards and hearing officers, special magistrates to do that kind of thing. But as this expands and gets outside of what I call normal code enforcement, I mean, is there a potential problem?
No, I just think you need to be careful and aware, and I looked also, and lots of other jurisdictions have assigned sound ordinance violations to the special magistrate. And I'm actually glad you brought this up, because I you know, going over these materials, I thought there is sort of a fair analogy, and not a perfect one, but a fair one to be made between the old system where they did have the municipal courts pre-1968 and this code compliance process that exists now. And I think in some ways the legislature is, like, by allowing these fines to be increased, is incentivizing local governments to refer more violations to the special magistrate in that way. And I think maybe at the end of the day, it doesn't matter so much, because they both go to the same place on appeal. They both end up in circuit court. And the reason it's attractive to me is, as I stated, you get to make a better record, generally speaking, in front of the hearing officer or the special magistrate. I think you'd agree. So that made it an attractive option as well.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I think we're about out of time. I think that Peter Blanton, I think we have some new restaurant concepts or sports bar concepts in the pipeline here.
Okay, I may not have been
And
aware of
one,
this.
for example, is at the Quay. Be the first restaurant. There's a outdoor restaurant, very high end, but there could be, I'm gonna vaguely speaking, a sports bar concept. And we have, in addition to the residents there, you almost have a speaker box kind of setup, you know, canyons of tall buildings. And I don't know how that could potentially make the sound even louder, because it's more boxed in. So I guess separately, the train's on the track. There's some things that could be problematic. What do we do about it in a problem we can foresee? And so that is a question I'd like to continue to work with. And everybody's maybe pointing fingers at each other between zoning and noise ordinances could end up with a mess. So,
Well, we don't need to, but
okay,
I think that, crowd noise is harder, more challenging to regulate because it's not like playing music or making sound, and it's hard to put limits on, but if it's a television set or something like that. So again, I think it's, closing times and location and confining it to indoors. And I think you can have higher decibel limits inside because you can do more to mitigate sound when the source of it's inside. So if it's controlled that way, but I think that's all zoning, those are conditions that are imposed when it goes through the approval process. If it's a conditional use, lots of ordinances have a sound mitigation review. And if it's deemed necessary, then it's the requirements are imposed.
well, listen, Doug, thank you for your time. I know you're a busy guy, and we appreciate your words and look forward to working through on this stuff.
Yes.
And again, time-wise, what is your current thinking time-wise?
Well, I've just asked for some additional time. I have at least, so I don't know, but on this ordinance, so as far as I'm here, I want to get through this ordinance. I want to have time to do it. But I think the first of the year, I think it's conceivable. We could have this at the first meeting in December, or maybe it's better to wait till after the first of the year, but right in that time frame on this ordinance, it's sort of pushed back a couple of months. But instead of only one aspect of it, I'll combine the two. So I think that would work better.
Well, you're welcome to stick around for the rest of the meeting or.
What's coming up?
Probably not.
Wine at the end.
Well, yeah, wine at the.
Well, maybe I should.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you.
All right.